Picture this. You've just turned 12 and instead of blowing out birthday candles, your parents are handing you over like livestock to a man old enough to be your grandfather. You have no say in the matter, no voice, no choice. Your entire future has been bartered away for a few silver coins and a promise of protection. Welcome to the life of a medieval woman, where happily ever after was less fairy tale promise and more death sentence wrapped in a wedding veil. If you think modern dating is brutal, wait until you hear about the medieval woman's nightmare that makes today's worst relationship horror stories look like romantic comedies. We're about to dive into a world where being born female was essentially a life sentence of servitude, abuse, and unimaginable suffering that history books conveniently gloss over. And if you're enjoying these dark historical truths that never made it into your school textbooks, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started with the brutal realities they don't want you to know. Let me transport you to a time when a woman's worth was measured not by her intelligence, dreams, or capabilities, but by how many male heirs she could produce before her body gave out completely. This isn't just another story about medieval hardships. This is the blood-soaked reality of what it truly meant to be born female in an era where your gender determined whether you lived as a human being or died as property. The marriage market in medieval times wasn't about love, compatibility, or even basic human decency. It was a flesh trade disguised as holy matrimony, where girls as young as 7 were promised in marriage and consummated these unions as soon as they reached what passed for physical maturity. Take the case of Margaret Beaufort, who was married off at 6 years old to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole. When that marriage was annulled for political reasons, she was immediately handed over to Edmund Tudor, who was twice her age. Edmund wasted no time consummating the marriage when Margaret was just 12, and the physical trauma of giving birth to Henry Tudor at 13 left her permanently damaged, never able to bear another child. But Margaret was nobility. She had some protection, some resources, servants to help her through the worst of it. Imagine being a peasant girl with absolutely nothing standing between you and whatever horrors your husband decided to inflict. Canon law stated that girls could marry at 12 and boys at 14, but the reality was far more disturbing. Families regularly promised their daughters in marriage while they were still toddlers, and these contracts were legally binding. You could be sold before you could even walk properly. Your entire destiny mapped out while you were still learning to speak. The betrothal ceremonies themselves were grotesque displays of objectification. Young girls, often dressed in adult clothing that hung loosely on their tiny frames, would be paraded before potential suitors like prize cattle at auction. Their teeth would be examined, their bodies scrutinized for signs of future fertility, and their bloodlines dissected like breeding charts. The girl's opinion was not just irrelevant. Asking for it would have been considered absurd. She was merchandise, and merchandise doesn't get to choose its buyer. The wedding night was essentially legalized assault, sanctioned by both church and state. Medieval medical texts actually provide instructions for husbands on how to break in their virgin wives, with advice that reads more like torture manuals than marriage guidance. The treatise Trotula, one of the most widely circulated medical texts of the period, contained detailed instructions on how to determine if a woman was truly a virgin, including invasive physical examinations and tests that were both humiliating and medically dangerous. These texts recommended everything from herbal concoctions designed to make women more compliant to physical techniques that would ensure the husband's pleasure while completely disregarding the woman's pain, fear, or basic humanity. One particularly disturbing manual suggested that if a wife seemed reluctant or fearful, the husband should persist with gentle force until her natural feminine submission emerges. The concept of consent was not just absent, it was considered irrelevant to the entire institution of marriage. Once married, a medieval woman entered what can only be described as a state of legal non-existence. Under the doctrine of coverture, she ceased to be a person in the eyes of the law. Her husband owned everything. Her body, her property, her children, even her thoughts were considered his domain. If she inherited land from her father, it immediately became her husband's property the moment she spoke her wedding vows. If she had money, jewelry, or any personal possessions, he controlled every item. If she bore children, they belonged entirely to him, and he could take them away from her at any time for any reason. She was literally nothing more than a walking incubator with no legal rights whatsoever. Court records from medieval England show cases where women tried to reclaim inheritances that had been stolen by their husbands, only to be told by judges that they had no legal standing to make such claims. In one documented case from 1347, a woman named Alice de Brienne attempted to regain control of lands that had belonged to her family for generations, but the court ruled that a married woman cannot own property any more than a child or a madman can enter into contracts. The church, which you might think offered some sanctuary, was actually one of the worst perpetrators of this systematic oppression. Religious texts taught that women were inherently evil, the source of all sin, and deserved whatever suffering befell them. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the medieval period, declared that women were defective and misbegotten males, essentially biological mistakes that God allowed to exist solely for reproduction purposes. He argued that women were created with defective reason and were naturally inclined toward evil because of their connection to Eve's original sin. This wasn't just theological theory, it had real-world consequences that shaped every aspect of medieval society. Priests regularly preached that women's suffering was a form of divine punishment that they deserved to endure. The popular medieval text Malleus Maleficarum went even further, claiming that women were more susceptible to witchcraft because they were intellectually like children and more carnal than men. This religious justification for abuse was so deeply ingrained that questioning it was considered heretical. This religious justification for abuse was so deeply ingrained that wife-beating wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged as a husband's sacred duty. The rule of thumb literally comes from the medieval law that a man could beat his wife with a stick, as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. But even this restriction was rarely enforced and was often interpreted liberally. Court records from the period show countless cases of husbands who beat their wives to death and received nothing more than a small fine if they were punished at all. One particularly horrific case from 1376 involved a merchant named Robert Sutton, who beat his wife Emma so severely that she lost sight in both eyes and suffered permanent brain damage. When Emma's father attempted to seek justice, the court ruled that Robert had been within his rights as a husband to correct his wife's disobedience, and he was ordered to pay a fine equivalent to the cost of 2 chickens. Emma spent the remaining 12 years of her life in a state of mental incapacity, unable to care for herself, while Robert remarried within 6 months and continued his merchant business without any social stigma. But the physical abuse was only one layer of the torture that medieval women endured. Psychological manipulation and emotional cruelty were considered normal aspects of marriage. Wives were expected to ask permission for everything: what to wear, what to eat, when to speak, even when to sleep. They were subjected to constant surveillance and suspicion, with husbands encouraged to monitor their wives' every movement for signs of disobedience or infidelity. The legal system actually provided guidelines for this surveillance. A husband was legally entitled to open and read all of his wife's correspondence, question anyone who spoke with her, and restrict her movements both inside and outside the home. If a woman was seen talking to another man, even in a completely innocent context, she could be accused of adultery and face severe punishment. The punishment for female adultery was often death, while male adultery was considered a minor transgression at worst. Let's talk about childbirth, because this is where the medieval woman's nightmare reached its absolute peak of horror. With no understanding of hygiene, anatomy, or proper medical care, giving birth was essentially a death lottery that women were forced to play repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. Statistics suggest that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from complications within the first year after giving birth. But here's the truly sickening part. If complications arose during labor, medieval medical practice prioritized saving the baby over the mother. The woman's life was considered expendable. Her only value lay in producing heirs. Medieval birthing practices were a grotesque spectacle of ignorance and superstition. Midwives, who were often just local women with no real training, would perform procedures that were more likely to kill than help. They believed that a difficult birth meant the woman was being punished for her sins, so they would often delay assistance, thinking the suffering was divinely mandated. When intervention was finally attempted, it usually involved brutal techniques like crushing the baby's skull to extract it, often resulting in the mother bleeding to death in agony. The birthing chamber itself was a place of terror. Women in labor were surrounded by female relatives who would pray loudly, burn incense, and sometimes perform what they believed were helpful rituals, like placing holy relics on the woman's stomach or making her drink concoctions containing ground-up animal bones. The smell of blood, sweat, and fear filled these rooms, and the screams of laboring women could be heard throughout entire neighborhoods. One documented case from 1456 describes the death of Lady Catherine Neville, who labored for 4 days with a breech birth. The midwife, believing that the prolonged labor was caused by Catherine's sins, refused to provide physical assistance and instead forced her to confess to various moral failings while in the throes of labor pains. When Catherine finally died from exhaustion and blood loss, the midwife blamed her death on her insufficient faith and faced no consequences for her negligence. But surviving childbirth was just the beginning of the torment. Medieval women were expected to produce child after child, with pregnancies happening almost annually, until their bodies completely broke down. There were no effective contraceptives, and even discussing methods to prevent pregnancy was considered heretical. The Church taught that any attempt to prevent conception was a sin against God's will, and women who sought such methods could be accused of witchcraft. Women would often be pregnant 15 to 20 times during their reproductive years, with many of these pregnancies ending in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. The physical toll was devastating. Contemporary accounts describe women whose teeth fell out from calcium deficiency, whose backs became permanently bent from carrying multiple pregnancies, and whose internal organs were so damaged from repeated births that they suffered constant pain and incontinence. The psychological toll of watching child after child die was never acknowledged or treated. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Some estimates suggest that up to 50% of children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Maternal mental health was an alien concept. Women who showed signs of what we would now recognize as postpartum depression or grief were labeled as possessed by demons or cursed by God. The treatment for such conditions often involved exorcism, public humiliation, or being locked away until they either recovered or died from neglect. Isabella of Valois, Queen of England and wife of Richard II, suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths during her short life. Contemporary chronicles describe how she would spend days weeping uncontrollably after each loss, refusing to eat or speak. Instead of receiving compassion or medical care, she was criticized by court physicians who claimed her excessive grief was evidence of weak feminine character and could cause future pregnancies to fail. She was subjected to various treatments, including bloodletting, forced fasting, and isolation, all of which likely worsened her mental state. Here's where things get even more disturbing. If a woman couldn't produce male heirs, she was considered a complete failure as a human being. History is littered with women who were divorced, abandoned, or worse, because they only gave birth to daughters. The cruel irony, of course, is that the sex of a child is determined by the father's genetics. But medieval science blamed the woman entirely. Queens were executed, noble ladies were sent to convents in disgrace, and common women were simply cast out to starve. Take the case of Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III of England. After giving birth to 4 children, she was publicly mocked and blamed when one of her sons died in infancy. The court physicians declared that she had corrupted blood and that any future children would be similarly cursed. This wasn't unusual. It was standard practice to blame women for every aspect of reproduction, from conception difficulties to birth defects to infant mortality. But perhaps the most famous example is Catherine of Aragon, whose inability to produce a male heir for Henry VIII led to her divorce, the break with Rome, and ultimately the English Reformation. Catherine endured at least 6 pregnancies, most ending in miscarriage or infant death. Each loss was blamed on her supposed moral failings, her age, or her foreign blood. Henry's physicians suggested that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, and Catherine was portrayed as a cursed woman whose womb was tainted by sin. The daily life of a medieval woman was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor and constant surveillance. She was expected to manage the household, which included everything from cooking and cleaning to brewing ale, making textiles, caring for livestock, and managing servants if the family was wealthy enough to have them. But she had to do all of this while being perpetually pregnant or recovering from childbirth, and under the constant scrutiny of her husband, who had the legal right to punish her for any perceived failure. The scope of a medieval woman's domestic responsibilities was truly staggering. She was expected to rise before dawn to start the cooking fires, milk the cows, collect eggs, and prepare breakfast for the entire household. She would spend hours each day spinning thread, weaving cloth and sewing clothes for her family. She had to preserve food for winter, make soap and candles, tend gardens, and care for sick family members with no medical knowledge or proper supplies. In wealthier households, women were responsible for managing complex domestic operations that included overseeing servants, maintaining household accounts, organizing feasts and entertainment, and handling correspondence. But they had to do all of this without any legal authority. They couldn't make contracts, couldn't buy or sell property, and couldn't make any major decisions without their husband's explicit permission. Women were forbidden from most trades and professions, barred from universities and formal education, and prohibited from owning property or conducting business in their own names. They couldn't testify in court, except in very limited circumstances, couldn't enter into contracts, and couldn't make any legal decisions without male approval. If their husbands died, they often had to fight their own children for basic survival, as inheritance laws strongly favored male heirs over widowed mothers. The few occupations available to women were typically extensions of domestic work. They could work as seamstresses, midwives, brewers, or innkeepers, but always under male supervision and for significantly lower wages than men. Even in these roles, they faced constant suspicion and regulation. Female brewers, for example, were subject to special taxes and regulations that didn't apply to men, and they could lose their licenses if they were accused of any moral transgression. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval women's oppression was how it was disguised as protection and honor. Society taught women that their suffering was noble, that their sacrifice was godly, and that their submission was the highest form of virtue. They were brainwashed into believing that their pain and degradation were actually signs of their moral superiority. This psychological manipulation was so effective that many women actively participated in oppressing other women, seeing rebellion against the system as shameful rather than justified. Medieval literature celebrated the suffering woman as the ideal of feminine virtue. The cult of courtly love portrayed women as pure, untouchable objects of worship, but this supposed reverence was actually another form of dehumanization. Women were placed on pedestals, not as recognition of their worth as human beings, but as a way of keeping them separate from real power and agency. They were worshipped as symbols while being denied basic rights as people. The legal system offered no recourse for abused women. Rape within marriage was literally impossible under medieval law. A husband could not rape his own property. If a woman tried to leave her husband, she could be forcibly returned and punished for abandonment. If she committed adultery, she could be executed, while her husband faced no consequences for his own infidelities. The double standard wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated as the natural order of things. Court records reveal the stunning inequality of medieval justice. In 1423, a woman named Joan White was sentenced to death for adultery, while her lover received only a small fine. When Joan's family appealed the sentence, arguing that she had been coerced into the relationship by threats of violence, the court responded that a woman's virtue is her own responsibility to maintain, regardless of circumstances. Even death offered no escape from this oppression. Medieval women were often buried in unmarked graves or recorded only as wife of or mother of in death records. Their individual identities were so thoroughly erased that we don't even know the names of most medieval women. They lived as shadows and died as footnotes, their entire existence reduced to their biological functions. The few women who managed to achieve any measure of independence or recognition were typically viewed with suspicion and often faced accusations of witchcraft or heresy. Women who showed intelligence, ambition, or any deviation from expected feminine behavior were seen as unnatural and dangerous. The witch trials that would later sweep through Europe had their roots in medieval attitudes toward women who refused to conform to societal expectations. Hildegard of Bingen, one of the few medieval women whose name we remember today, was a brilliant composer, philosopher, and mystic who managed to establish her own convent and gain some measure of independence. But even she faced constant challenges to her authority. and was frequently accused of being possessed by demons rather than blessed with divine inspiration. Her writings reveal the constant struggle she faced to be taken seriously as a religious thinker rather than dismissed as a hysterical woman. Now, before you think this was just the brutal reality for everyone in medieval times, let me give you some perspective. While medieval men certainly faced hardships, disease, war, poverty, and harsh working conditions, they had legal rights, social mobility, and basic human dignity that women were systematically denied. A peasant man could potentially become a merchant, a soldier, or even a priest. He could own property, make contracts, and testify in court. He could choose his profession, travel freely, and make decisions about his own life. A woman, regardless of her intelligence, capabilities, or noble birth, was trapped in a system that viewed her as subhuman from birth to death. Even the most privileged women lived under restrictions that would have been unthinkable for men of any social class. A peasant man had more legal rights than a queen when it came to basic personal autonomy. The economic system was designed to keep women dependent and powerless. Women's work was consistently undervalued, even when it was essential to household survival. A woman could work just as hard as her husband in the fields, manage the entire household, bear and raise multiple children, and still be considered economically worthless because her labor was not monetized in the same way as male labor. The most heartbreaking aspect of all this is how thoroughly this oppression was normalized. Medieval literature, art, and religious texts all portrayed women's suffering as beautiful, noble, and divinely ordained. The cult of the suffering female martyr wasn't just religious symbolism. It was social programming designed to make women accept their own destruction as virtuous. Popular stories of the time celebrated women who died rather than lose their chastity, who endured horrific abuse in silence, and who sacrificed their own well-being for their husbands and children. These tales weren't meant to inspire sympathy for women's suffering. They were meant to teach women that suffering was their natural and proper role in life. The few historical accounts we have of women questioning this system are quickly dismissed or punished. When Christine de Pizan wrote The Book of the City of Ladies in 1405, challenging prevailing attitudes about women's intellectual capabilities, she was widely criticized and accused of being unnatural and presumptuous. Her work was groundbreaking precisely because it was so rare for a woman to publicly defend her own gender's worth and capabilities. So there you have it, the brutal, unvarnished truth about what it meant to be a medieval woman. A reality so horrific that even our modern struggles pale in comparison to the systematic dehumanization that defined female existence for centuries. These women lived and died in a world that viewed them as nothing more than reproductive machinery, denied basic human rights that we now take for granted, and subjected to levels of cruelty and indifference that are almost impossible for us to comprehend today. The legacy of this oppression lasted for centuries and continues to influence attitudes toward women in many parts of the world today. The medieval period established patterns of thinking about women's roles, capabilities, and worth that would take hundreds of years to begin to dismantle. Every right that women enjoy today was fought for against the backdrop of centuries of systematic dehumanization that began in the medieval period. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I can vote, own property, choose my own career, marry for love, and make decisions about my own body and life without being sold like cattle or treated as someone else's property. And if these dark historical truths have opened your eyes to just how far we've come and how precious these freedoms really are, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more shocking revelations about the past that textbooks don't dare tell you. The medieval world was far darker than you ever imagined, and we're just scratching the surface of these buried horrors that shape the world we live in today.